Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the official Oscarina nomination coverage for Castlevania Rondo of Blood. Here at the Oscarinas, we have a bit of a bias against sequels. We have so many games to showcase, and as a result, we'll tend to avoid spotlighting sequels unless they're able to make major improvements or deviations from their prior games. So, with Rondo of Blood, we have another game in the same series as Super Castlevania 4 from last year's Game Awards. How will a game possibly be able to improve on a game that managed to take home the large majority of awards from last season? Well, it is a tall order, but with the talents of the director of Castlevania Symphony of the Night and the enhanced processing power of the PC Engine CD system, Rondo of Blood was able to make a number of major improvements and changes when compared with Castlevania 4. As a result, we would like to honor Rondo of Blood with the well-deserved nominations in the categories of Challenge and Achievement, Discovery, and Art Direction. Here with me tonight is my guest, Mitch. Mitch, thank you for joining me tonight.
Happy to be here. Just as a heads up to those listening, I do want to mention that throughout our discussion, we probably will be mentioning Castlevania 4 a number of times, and probably going to be revealing the things that it did or did not win. So if you've not seen Season 1, I recommend you go and watch that first, because it's going to be full spoilers ahead. We're going to assume that you've seen the past season and you know all the winners, etc.
Yeah, and while we're on the topic of spoilers, when I get to the Challenge and Achievement section, I am going to spoil a major gameplay feature of the game, but it gets introduced maybe like an hour or so into the game.
Yeah, I mean, we always recommend you play the games yourself first. I think that kind of goes without saying, because they're reward worthy, as we say.
Well, certainly. In the world of Castlevania Rondo of Blood, the evil vampire Dracula is fated to resurrect every 100 years, bringing calamity and destruction in his wake. This time around, his resurrection is caused by the greed of a sect of evil men who seek eternal life and power. This game's iteration of Dracula is more philosophical than Castlevania 4, as he reflects on and justifies his existence as an extension of the sins of humanity. You play as Richter, a vampire hunter from the Belmont lineage, whose familial duty to slay Dracula coincides with his desire to rescue his girlfriend from Dracula's corrupting clutches. The gameplay consists of side-scrolling battling and platforming as he combats Dracula and the creatures of darkness that serve under him. Rondo of Blood was released in 1993 for the PC Engine Super CD-ROM. It was developed and published by Konami, and the game was directed by Toru Hagihara, who later went on to direct and produce Castlevania Symphony of the Night.
So, I think it would be a good idea to start with just a little precursor of our experiences playing with the game. We both played it. I did not finish it. It was too hard for me. That's just the long and short of it. Sorry, I'm a wuss. But you finished it, right?
Oh, well, certainly. In fact, for context, this was the very first game I played for the Game Awards this year, and it left a very positive impression on me. But like Mitch is saying, it is quite a hard game. It definitely took me a number of sessions, particularly Death. He kicked my butt many a time. But the times I was getting my butt kicked, I was having a more pleasant time having my butt kicked than when I was in the dungeon in Castlevania 4.
I love how the torture chamber from Castlevania 4 is now this like staple of frustration for you.
It's really weird. I would have expected that Challenge and Achievement would be a bit more uniform as far as how we experience it, but you had me banging my head against that stupid torture chamber for freaking like over a week, I think, and you had a great time with Castlevania 4. Whereas like for me, I'm like feeling like this game is providing me with a steady and, you know, continual progression of difficulty that seems difficult but fair. And you, the Dark Souls veteran here, is like, oh no, this is too much for me and stuff like that. So go figure, it's just a bit more subjective than I sort of expected as far as your challenge goes.
Well, yeah, and that's actually a good point, because we actually differ, I think, quite a bit when it comes to the gameplay, the challenge and achievement section for this game. So it'll make, I hope, for an interesting conversation to kind of hear us go back and forth with it. But yeah, I'm going to let you kind of take the reins for that one and kick things off. So, and I'm just going to kind of take a back seat, because I want to make sure I'm listening to you thoroughly and get a good impression of why this game stuck with you. And before you do that, I'm just going to slip in a quick note that if you see really bad gameplay, that's because it's me playing. I apologize in advance. I have nothing else for you. I did my best. Okay, go for it.
Sure thing. All right, so the first point I'd like to bring up for challenge and achievement was the gameplay spoiler I alluded to earlier. So, when you're playing Act 2, you come across a secret which unlocks Maria, who is a separate playable character alongside the main character Richter. In my opinion, Maria acts as the best easy mode that I've ever seen in a video game. By playing Maria, you get an entirely different set of weapons, sub-weapons, and item crashes, which I'll explain later. But the short of it is, as a separate character, you get a totally separate set of tools that you can use to take down enemies.
Right.
Yeah. Aside from giving you a different set of strictly offensive tools, Maria also has much more free-flowing and satisfying movement compared to Richter. Unlike Richter, you get a double jump. You have a slide ability, which allows you to move very quickly, along with compressing your hitbox to be smaller. And your main attack is sending out a dove. When you use a dove as Maria, you're still free to move around while the dove's flying and attacking the enemy. Whereas with Richter,
Yeah.
you're locked into like a 7-frame animation while he's whipping out his chain and so forth. So, and I mean, that was a big hindrance for you in terms of difficulty, but for me, it just felt sort of like Dark Souls, where your tools are more limited, so you have to be more tactical and strategic about how you're using them. But with Maria, you can kind of just let fly, dove here, dragon here, tiger here, while you're just zooming around and overall having a great time and such.
Well, that is the great thing about it, is that when you play as Richter, everything is very committal. It's cool that you have the two separate characters to represent different styles, so if you're frustrated with one, you can try another and poke at the game from that angle.
So yeah, the general basics of what it is that makes her so good is that she has different sets of weapons, and she has much more movement, and her weapon uses are, in general, less committal, so you have more flexibility and movement and, so forth. Instead of the usual vampire affair of throwing, like, holy water crosses and things you would normally associate with Vampire Hunter, she gets a set of animal companions, which, in my opinion, are both cute and cool. You can have a small tiger cub who runs out and attacks enemies 3 times, very cute, but then you use the item crash for that same tiger cub, and it becomes a flaming spirit giant tiger that zooms around the screen while Maria rides on top of it. And even aside from that being cool, one of her item crashes, she gets to use a freaking dragon, which, who doesn't like dragons? So, yeah, I found that to be, while not what you expect from Castlevania, a very fun and entertaining method to dispatch your enemies.
For sure.
In general, because she's got this different set of tools, and because movement in particular is very enhanced, it makes it so that when you're going back and secret seeking or replaying levels just for funsies, in general, it just makes the experience a lot more enhanced because you're getting a different set of tools, and it kind of makes the challenge a different experience. And if it's a level that you've already played once and you want to just get through it to get to the secret, it definitely makes it a lot more easy and feasible with Maria while still being fun at the same time. So even if for players who don't want to use easy mode for the sake of making levels easier, they'll still appreciate it for the quality of life it provides when you're playing levels over again, which I appreciate. Aside from that, even when you're playing as Maria, the game is far from being a cakewalk. While she does have improved movement and some improved weapons, she has less HP than Richter, and such that, like, for certain levels that have infrequent checkpoints and hard to avoid damage, I actually had an easier time with Richter than with Maria, because my ballpark approximation, don't quote me on this, is that, like, Richter takes, like, 7 hits to kill, and Maria's more like 5 hits to kill. Aside from that, enemies and item pickups are still unchanged in terms of their frequency and the overall level design. So they still have all of their attack patterns that you'll need to learn, even if you have better options for dealing with them. So, if there was an enemy where the boss attack was just really hard for you to dodge, you'll have an easier time dodging it, but you still have to see, okay, when's he, got his lead up for the attack, and when do I start bailing from my attack, and, when do I come in to try and dish out some damage. This is also kind of nice because since they just leave all the enemies and the level design intact and they just soup your character up, it's a lot less development time because they don't have to, like, meticulously tweak all the individual enemies so that they got more health or things like that. They'll just slap you with an easier character and call it a day, basically, which is kind of nice. Aside from that, you also happen to have pretty excellent power fantasy from having a character who seems rather weak, but then you happen to be doing particularly excellent with her. And in general, it just provides for sort of a unique pastiche. I mean, I can't really think of that many games where you've got a pretty serious game world and then you get to play as a, not serious character, but in a way that still sort of meshes with the setting of the game to an extent and whatnot. And yeah, I thought that those were all interesting side effects, but it's also, you got a frilly pink dress in sort of a Castlevania game, so it might not be for everyone, but that's the thing. It's a optional character. You don't have to go through it if you don't like it, but for people who it is their thing, like myself, it's pretty interesting, in my opinion.
Well, and I like how they do commit to it full stop. Like, when you die as Richter, he actually disintegrates in, like, these patches of pixelated blood. But if you die as Maria, that doesn't happen. She just kind of phases out of existence. And even the game over text is different, and it's very, like, kindergartner feeling. That's the first word I could think of, where it's just these bright colors and funky letters.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's kind of impressive how much that they really, went all out and committed to the theme of Maria, where, other games might have just, easy mode more of, just a, afterthought thing. And this is a character who's, fully fleshed out with, voiceover lines that are different for the scenes and different set of animations, and it's pretty interesting how much that they put the extra work into even doing things like the game over screen, like you said. So moving on, so I would say that in general, part of what makes Maria such a good easy mode thing is that her story differs somewhat from Richter, and I think that the way that her story presents itself, while nothing anything super in depth, is very fitting for an easy mode playthrough. When Maria introduces herself, Richter himself is claiming that this is too dangerous for her and she should really leave this to him because this is more for, a little vampire business. And Maria, indignant at this, says, "You don't know anything," and apparently decides to go off and do the vampire hunting on her own. So Maria is angry at being underestimated and wants to prove herself. And while she is gaining victory and recognition through her actions, you get to revel in that yourself by beating up evil characters as a 12-year-old girl and sort of also feeling the both underestimation and the reveling in the overcoming of those expectations by playing as the person who seems like they wouldn't be able to handle it, and they can handle it way better than Richter, which is pretty great. And I would say that in the same way that Richter sort of poo-poos her due to her appearing weak and inexperienced, and then it ends up, she ends up being a great help. It sort of parallels, in my opinion, the player's own journey to come and appreciate and enjoy easy mode, despite the player's own negative preconceptions. I mean, for me, I come into this easy mode, maybe with those preconceptions, and all of a sudden, oh wow, this is actually really fun in a different way. And it's sort of similar to Maria overcoming her negative preconceptions. I sort of have a similar experience where, I come into this, easy mode basically, and I end up having a great time despite thinking that it wouldn't be something I would enjoy, which is pretty neat in my opinion. And the other thing I think is a slight problem is that, so for people who do want to play through the game on easier difficulty, where they're still able to complete the game, they are still getting a fundamentally different experience than, for example, if they just made an easy mode Richter, because the theming is different, the story is different, and for someone like me who's going to experience both, that's not an issue. But for people who can only play the game as Maria, maybe they actually want to have the, gothic, hardcore, serious experience, and they might be a bit bummed out that the fact that they have this experience is very different than that. So that's about it for Maria as easy mode. The next thing that I'd like to bring up as far as the, reasons why Rondo of Blood has good challenge and achievement is how fighting enemies often feels like satisfying duels between skilled fighters. So while Castlevania 4, you had more enemies which would pop out, but you'll kill them in one hit, or because you dish out damage so quick in that game, just 2 or 3 and they're instantly gone. There's more enemies in Rondo of Blood which take several hits to take down, such that you actually have to pause and make sure that you're taking down the right way without taking damage and such. They also will have usually multiple different attack patterns, and multiple different movement patterns. And the enemies will switch between these movement and attack options somewhat randomly, which keeps the encounters tense and interesting. Enemies tend to get trickier when you also throw in the variables of positioning and platforming, where, maybe you got to fight them when there's a pit of death in between you and them, or things like that. And enemies get way trickier when you've got multiple enemies coming at you at once. So with this backdrop of having this skilled fighter enemy one-on-one, if you then add the extra challenge of multiple of them, it gets to be pretty tricky. So that's about it for how the enemies that you're fighting feel to fight. And then, in general, as far as how you deal with them, the playstyle the game encourages you to play is akin to being a spacer in a fighting game. Your weapon range is short enough that you have to get in close with the enemies, but it's long enough that you will usually barely outrange the enemy's attack patterns if you stay near the edge of your whip. So you have to get in close with the enemies, but not too close, and just generally stay at the optimal distance so you're whipping them with the tip of your whip. And what's neat about the fact that you have a particular spacing you're trying to maintain is that it means you have to be carefully watching the enemy, because when they move, you have to move with them to stay at that particular range that you like. While that's usually how it would work under the more normal movement options, occasionally the enemies might also whip out a slow but large movement or attack option where you can't just keep fighting them. You got to switch to just purely defensively running out of the way and going back to your spaced attack option. So in addition to the previous thing I mentioned where you've got to be carefully moving in conjunction with the enemy, you'll also have to be keeping track of when do you attack and when do you switch from attacking to just defending and getting the heck out of the way. And with both of those put together, in my opinion, fighting enemies is a very satisfying, duel-like experience. That being said, though, the satisfying duel form of difficulty is perhaps less fitting of a spooky game compared to Castlevania IV's difficulty that felt more like pop-up enemies in a haunted house, where oh shoot, he got me, either he gets you or he doesn't get you, and then you just whack him out of existence and such. So there's pros and cons involved with the approach, but in general, it provides a different kind of difficulty experience than Castlevania 4, which is still very good, hence why I wanted to highlight it. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, and I think too, Castlevania 4 winning Best Gameplay Challenge and Achievement last season was... I feel like that's going to become a rather controversial pick as the years go on, because a lot of people, especially those who are more refined, they're veteran players, especially in the Castlevania field, they have a breeze with that game. They think that game's very easy, and they have a right to feel that way. I mean, you can stun lock enemies pretty easily. You can, like you said, just thrash them with your whip without trying so hard, and your whole toolkit is... I mean, it's just the whip. You don't even need your sub-weapons throughout the whole game, pretty much. But, the thing that kind of pushed it over the edge had more to do with the fact that it was really cathartic to play, and it's really satisfying to overcome the challenges that you do face. And that part of that challenge has to do with your environmental navigation as well. So having to deal with enemies, the enemy in isolation is fine, but when you put him in a scenario, like at the end of a walkway that's collapsing, that's where the challenge exists. It's not so much these one-to-one fights like you're describing here. And this one kind of does both, I feel. I feel like Rondo has, like you're describing, I'm just remembering back and playing and feeling like, yes, this happens a lot, where you've got an enemy and it's going to take multiple hits to take him down. And there's generally some kind of obstacle around you, whether it's like a swinging ball and chain or something like that. And so you're trying to avoid that. You're trying to hit the enemies. And it can be fun. For me, it was really frustrating because you're very limited in what you can do. And that's like the key difference in how it works in Castlevania 4 versus here. Like, if you jump, you're committed to that jump, and you have very little wiggle room as to what you can do in the air. If you swing the whip, same thing. You also can't do 8-directional whip combat. You're limited to just straight in front of you. So it's very tactical, it's very smart, and it's like a thinking man's kind of game in terms of the combat. That's all well and good, but I think if you liked Castlevania 4, it's going to be a bit of an adjustment at the very least, because in that game, you're very much a powerhouse and you're just kind of slaughtering everything. But, you do have to account for the fact that the enemies are lying in wait against you. So it sort of makes you feel powerful while also making the situation you're in dangerous and difficult. Whereas in this one, I just think I felt more along the lines of just not powerful the whole game.
Yeah.
It's
funny too, because the game tries to sell you on the sensation of power in a way, because they give you these over-the-top item crashes and things like that make you look like a Super Saiyan. But at the same time, though, item crashes pale in comparison to the almighty noodle chain. So, what can I say?
I couldn't have put it better myself.
So that's sort of my thoughts on how the enemies feel like a satisfying duel in Rondo of Blood. The next thing I want to talk about regarding Rondo of Blood is how sub-weapons are, in my opinion, more useful and fun than they were in Castlevania 4. So as I previously alluded to, Richter's primary weapon is the whip, which he always has access to. But he can pick up one of 6 other sub-weapons, which can be used at the expense of hearts, which are items that you pick up. There are different uses for each of the 6 sub-weapons. 4 out of 6 of them are similarly useful in their own way, and the remaining 2, the knife and the stopwatch, are still decent, even if they're not exactly my primary weapon of choice. So this is in contrast to Castlevania 4, which, while its whip felt very good and satisfying, it was so good and satisfying that you might not be as inclined towards focusing on your sub-weapons. Whereas here, you've got a less good whip and more good sub-weapons, which are also a bit better balanced, so that you aren't just going to always pick Grand Cross every time. Another nice quality of life is that when you're leading up to a boss fight, you likely have an intro room where it's playing this rather ominous music that's really getting you tense and ready for an epic showdown. But while that's going on, you actually get your choice of the 4 sub-weapons. Sometimes they're a bit tricky, and they always find interesting ways to make it so that you can have your choice of sub-weapons. But because they're always giving you that choice, and they're putting you here when you die against the boss, this makes the choice of sub-weapon when you're fighting a boss much more of a strategic decision. Rather than just whatever happens to be available, you're actually thinking about it a bit more and thinking, which one of these is going to be the most helpful for beating this boss in particular, which is rather nice. In general, sub-weapons often feel like an effective counter for enemies at a price. They allow you to attack at angles and at ranges that are not possible with the whip, and as a result, with certain enemies who come at angles that are very unfriendly to the whip, or you think are just hard, you can just deal with them much easier if you send a few sub-weapons their way. In a way, they kind of feel like, I'm going to pay you 6 hearts to go the heck away, for when you got this big nuisance that you're just having a really hard time dealing with. In addition to that being the general vibe of the sub-weapons, they've now introduced the sub-weapon crash ability, which is a very effective move that causes the entire screen to have some form of damage usually, but they come at a larger price of hearts. At minimum it's 10 hearts, but some of the item crashes cost like 50, especially with Maria, where they're more powerful and more heart-consuming. They also end up making Richter temporarily invincible, so they can function as a dodge of sorts if there's an enemy attack that's too hard to avoid. And because they've got these item crashes always lingering, it means that if you're really just blowing through a stage and beating the enemies no problem using your whip only, you'll have more hearts for use against the boss, and you'll never have a situation where you have so many hearts that it's pointless to get any more, because you can always spend the extra hearts using the item crashes, which is free damage and some invincibility. So it means that you're always on the hunt for hearts, and it always feels good when you are acquiring it throughout the level. It sort of brings me to my next point, is that through the use of sub-weapons and figuring out whether you want to spend the hearts or not, it's an interesting exercise in resource management. I never personally felt like I had an excess number of hearts because I was frequently using them on enemies. And so every time I fought an enemy, I was trying to figure out, well, do I want to use my sub-weapons to beat this enemy when I could use it to better deal with the boss later? Do I want to use this sub-weapon to beat this enemy when I'm at high health to prevent damage? Or do I want to wait until I'm at low health and I'm desperate? And Alternatively, should I use my sub-weapons to beat this difficult enemy that infinitely respawns, or should I try and save it for an enemy that doesn't infinitely respawn? Because it just feels bad to use it on those stupid imps that keep dropping from the ceiling, but at the same time, it's like, but they're so difficult to deal with, so you kind of got it. So it's kind of an interesting push and pull, trying to figure out, when to use your sub-weapons and when not to. And that's kind of my breakdown of how I feel sub-weapons are pretty fun and interesting in Rondo of Blood. Anything you want to add, Mitch?
Yeah, that's a really good point. This game does pressure you to use your sub-weapons more often, and it was something that, we talked about not being well utilized in Castlevania 4. I mean, this game feels much more intentional about the actual moment-to-moment gameplay and making sure that, are they using their sub-weapons? Do they have enough hearts, but not too many hearts to do so? And are we creating enemies that allow for those situations? A lot of the enemies that come at you from the air or from below, that's really a problem because you can't whip in all 8 directions, so now you need sub-weapons to back you up. I mean, you can try to deal with them, but it just ends up not going very well. And I think part of my problem playing is that, but I'm still thinking of it in terms of Castlevania 4. And so I end up trying to back up and jump and slash a guy in the air as he's coming at me. And really, I should just have the proper sub-weapon and use that. And I think the first stage actually has these crows that are just perched and swing at you. Yeah, that took me, I kid you not, an hour and a half. And that's I'm ashamed to admit, but they were just driving me crazy. I just could not hit them to save my life until I figured out that I could just hit them with the daggers. And so I would just inch forward and kind of have the screen pull them until they were on screen, but before they had seen me, so they hadn't been active, then I would just jump and hit them with the daggers and they'd die. And so that was my solution to that, and that is rewarding. That's on some level what I'm supposed to do, but yeah, it was a different kind of headspace to get into, and I think it was, I don't know, I become a creature of habit, I think, and I just connected so much with 4 that it was really tough to reacclimate into this new format and be like, no, you need the sub-weapons, you need to use them, you need to use them well.
Yeah, I can definitely understand what you're saying as far as the ingrained habits sort of impairing your gameplay. I actually had kind of an interesting exercise because, last time me and my brother got really into Super Smash Brothers, unlike prior games where I would just pick a main and stick with it, I actually eventually got to the point of having 4 mains that I would rotate between every game. And it really, in my opinion, kind of helped expand my brain flexibility. But for a long while there were plenty of times where it's oh, he's doing this one thing, I just gotta do my down B move and totally counter that. Oh crap, wrong down B move and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
I mean, even now I would say that it still hinders my experience a bit as far as taking a little bit of time to get back in the groove of things, but it's certainly easier for me now that I've had a month or two of just honing in that ability to switch mindsets and things like that. So that might be part of why I had a somewhat easier time, both that flexibility and also maybe that I didn't get quite as in the mode for Castlevania 4, because you had to record so much footage for that game, so you probably became an expert through and through, I imagine.
Pretty much. Yeah, I did play Castlevania 4 3 or 4 times and recorded that many different playthroughs of it. To go back to the subject of adaptability, I can do it. I could sit and play Rondo of Blood hours and hours and hours, but it's kind of I need to go through a ton of different games, and that's not accounting for all the things in my personal life. And so, at some point...
personal life? How dare you? Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so it basically just hits that scenario where I'm okay, am I enjoying myself enough to try and want to keep beating my head against this, or am I just going to let it go? And I hate to say it, but there's just basically a breaking threshold at which I'm okay, game, you're being too difficult. You want something from me that I don't have the mental space to do right now. And I think this is kind of why the category of best gameplay challenge and achievement is so interesting, and why video games as a whole are so interesting, is that they are kind of learning a new language, I like to put it, even on a small level, because you really do have to remap your brain and understand what the game wants you to do. And for a lot of modern games, there's this trend to make things easy and make it approachable, and they do that because they want it to sell, and they figure it's not going to sell well if people have to really strain themselves to quote-unquote get it. But therein lies the problem, because that's where a lot of the richness and enjoyment comes from, and it's why, the From Software games, the Souls games, have done so well, is they stayed committed to that, and the game doesn't bend for you, you have to bend for the game. And so, I don't know, there's no, necessarily right or wrong way to do it. Rondo of Blood is well remembered because of the kind of experience it provides. And so I don't want to act like, I had a bad time with it, so therefore it's not good. I'm just trying to kind of elaborate my extensive thoughts of where there was a conflict, and that just understanding that this is a very different beast. It's almost like a kind of sequel movie that was made by a different director and a different writer, and so it just has a very different feel. That's probably the best way I could describe it, or to provide an equivalent.
Yeah, no, I could definitely see that. And yeah, I mean, Rondo of Blood, since it has a different feel from Castlevania 4, it's no guarantee that if you like one, you'll like the other, and that's fine. And I mean, I'm not going to throw too much flack on Mitch to a certain extent, because, as the final chairman, he's sort of obligated to gather footage and trying out, lots and lots of games. Whereas for me, as a mere mini chairman, I can sort of pick the little corner of stuff that I like and just, really go in depth with it, and I'm not going to be in as much of a time clock of needing to cut myself off when I got other stuff to do. So
yeah, but I mean, nevertheless, it's still interesting to talk about, and that's always where part of we land here at the Academy, because I don't make everybody play the games. I figure that's not really worthwhile when your experiences are going to vary so much, and so evaluation is this kind of back and forth relationship between talking about it, looking stuff up about it, and playing it yourself. And so anyways, did you have any other thoughts on the challenge and achievement? I had one other point I want to make at the end, but I kind of want to make sure you've kind of filled through everything you wanted to say.
Sure. So yeah, I got 2 other points on challenge and achievement. They're not as ridiculously long as the other ones I pointed out. So the other point I wanted to bring up, or one of them, about challenge and achievement, is that, in my opinion, there is a satisfying punishment level for mistakes. There's almost no stupid death traps, spikes. So mistakes mean that you will usually get hurt and not killed, which I very much appreciate.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, most, if not all, sources of damage are avoidable, such that most of the time, if you do get hurt, you did something wrong. Now, mind you, some are definitely easier to avoid than others, but there's usually at least a way you can avoid it. As previously mentioned, Richter takes 7 hits before he dies, and as a result, every time that you have a life, you'll have several learning opportunities from your mistakes before you die. So, I've never really been much of a fan of games like, Cave Story Hard Mode, where you play until you get touched once and then you're dead and you gotta go a long way back. It's just, and partially the reason for that is because you get so few opportunities to learn from your mistake, whereas if you get several, then it's okay, well, now I'm on my second life. I don't just get to have one thing that I can do better. I have okay, I could do this better, this better, this better, and this better, which is, generally allows for a more smooth progression of learning and whatnot, which is nice. And lastly, this is still a thing that was carried over from Castlevania 4, but health pickups are satisfyingly rare, such that your mistakes feel consequential, but not unrecoverable. I mean, I remember specifically that, the kind of health system I was playing growing up is Mega Man 8, where, especially if you get the health power-ups in that one, you're just being showered in health, left and right, to the point where I didn't really feel as much of a, major consequence for getting hit. And, playing the Castlevania games, this one and Castlevania 4, was a breath of fresh air, because I'm oh my gosh, it's so hard to get that chicken, and when it shows up, you're staring at it just as deliciously as Simon Belmont is, because it's oh, thank you, I've been going so long. So it's nice that the health pickups, you get a lot of health, and you get it very infrequently, so that the health pickups feel big, and every time you get hit, it also is a big deal. And then the last thing I want to bring up about challenge and achievement is that, similar to Castlevania 4, Rondo of Blood has very good enemy variety throughout the game. Yeah, so that's kind of my general thoughts on Rondo of Blood challenge and achievement. You can feel free to take it away with any other additions or feedback that you wanted to add on to the category.
I think you covered everything pretty well, but yeah, it's just a tough one to kind of wrap your head around. I think the best way I could describe it is that the problem is that the experience is very gamey. Like when you brought up that example of going to the pre-chamber, the room before the boss, and you can pick up, the different sub-weapons that you want, and then you go in. That makes sense from a mechanical perspective, but I think it kind of, not that it detracts something, but it wasn't something I felt that I needed in the last one, and so it comes across as this kind of mechanical way to solve a problem that wasn't there. Like when I play a game, I want to feel like my avatar is an extension of myself, and for me, Rondo doesn't do that. It restricts your whip to one direction, not because it's intuitive, but because that's how the originals did it. And by golly, we're going to honor that. And I'm not saying that Castlevania 4 was realistic, but if you've never played a Castlevania game before, why would you assume that you can't swing a whip into the air? And there's also like an iconography in seeing Simon lunge into the air and cast his whip. And that, for me, is another reason why the gameplay is so rich. Rondo seems a little less interested in punchy, impactful blows and more on the kind of hard math of player mastering each I was just going through my notes here and saying each unreadable movement. I don't know if they're totally unreadable, though. I think that's a bit harsh.
I mean, you probably just got, completely trounced by, death right before you wrote that one. So if you had a particular comment that was harsh, it's fully understood and forgiven, because there are moments in Rondo like that. So, not a problem.
That's probably where it was. I don't know. Rondo, I think, makes it clear to me just how innovative Castlevania 4 actually was, which is another reason that I think that I value Castlevania 4's win there so much. Is it's not just about the one thing, but also it truly was doing something really different with the 8-directional movement, and it doesn't necessarily work in the ways that maybe it should for every Castlevania game, but I do think it was a worthwhile experience. I would be interested to play a Castlevania game that has the 8-directional movement, but the whip doesn't extend across the whole screen, and you still have to use your sub-weapons for, certain types of enemies. I think that would be a worthwhile pursuit, but we're kind of it's sort of locked into two different types, or two different forms, and you have to kind of pick your battles.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that I think it was one of the other Castlevanias actually let you whip diagonally up, but not every direction and stuff like that. So it was a little bit more of a compromise between the old and the new ones and whatnot. Between Castlevania 4 and the old ones and such.
I think that's Bloodlines. Yeah. I think that's next season, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think it might have been Bloodlines. I just wasn't sure. But yeah, I will say that in general, I do agree with what you said about Rondo of Blood feeling more gamey and less immersive, but we'll probably dissect that a bit more in exploration. But I can see how that would bleed through also in how it comes across with the difficulty, because something like Castlevania 4's difficulty stems from you're in a spooky place and something jumps out at you unexpectedly and you fall into a pit and you die. It's very apropos of exploring a haunted house, whereas in this one, you show up in a spooky mansion, and then all of a sudden you draw your sword, and then the enemy draws his thing, and then you guys have an epic fight and stuff like that. It's it's very satisfying, but it also feels much more of a video gamey than than Castlevania 4 is just exploring a spooky place and whatnot. Is kind of my thinking there.
Yeah, every enemy has to be on guard, and then you have to get down and dirty with them for this little exchange, which is cool, but also, yeah, I agree with that sentiment entirely. It's not quite as, or it's not the same kind of theatrics. It's almost like The Princess Bride, where, they enter this duel and the fight scene is foreverly long, and it's almost like the movie stops for a minute just so we can have this fight. I mean, you don't care, though, because it's such a great scene, but, yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, why don't we jump into best gameplay, discovery, and expression then? I think that would be a good segue for that, so we can kind of see the other half of the gameplay experience here in Rondo.
So for the first point on discovery expression, I want to talk about how item discovery works in Rondo of Blood compared to Castlevania 4. So Rondo of Blood still has the same things that you're discovering. You've got health, hearts, sub-weapons, and score bonuses. Health operates pretty similar to Castlevania 4, being infrequent and impactful. However, as previously mentioned, hearts are a bit more useful because of the fact that your sub-weapons you're using more often, and you have the item crashes for sub-weapons. So for both of those reasons, finding hearts ends up being more useful and more satisfying overall compared to Castlevania 4. Lastly, the score that you accumulate in levels are useful for more than just giving you an extra life. The score is also useful for purchasing video examples of how to beat certain bosses using an option in the main menu. Without grinding, you only get enough score to purchase a few videos, so score pickups will continue being useful for the entire game. That ends up being a nice bonus for the score pickups as well, which ends up making them feel more useful than Castlevania 4. So for all those reasons, I would probably say Rondo of Blood has generally more useful item discoveries than in Castlevania 4.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I really liked the fact that they used the score system to actually count for something other than just points, because as a home console game, there's really no reason to have a point score. It's this, relic left over from the arcades that they included for like who do you brag to? You want the score in the arcade where everybody can see it. But having it, tied to the console, I like that they came up with another creative use for it. And it's one that just is not something you have to have. You don't need to collect score points as you do with experience points, but you can use them to get hints and tips on how to complete the game. So yeah, I thought that was an elegant use of them.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree. So the next point that I want to highlight about Discovered Expression in Rondo of Blood are the secret level paths that it now includes in the various levels. So each of the first 4 levels in Rondo of Blood have secret alternative exit paths. By doing tasks like breaking certain walls, you'll be able to complete an alternate second half to the level, which usually culminates in an alternative boss to the level. The way to unlock some of these alternate exits can be pretty creative and integrate pretty well with the level you're traveling in. Like, for example, there's one segment where you knock down a spiked ball, which breaks a cracked floor, and when you backtrack to that cracked floor, there's an underground passageway that you can now enter and explore. In addition, one of the early alternative paths involves falling down a pit, which players are likely to do anyway, because the jumps are kind of hard to make. So users are not likely to miss the existence of these alternative paths. Once they fall down that pit in that level, they'll be all of a sudden on the hunt for, oh shoot, well, maybe I can find alternate paths elsewhere and such. So generally, I find the secret level paths very enjoyable to explore and find out as you're playing through the levels. It's kind of interesting because when I went into Rondo of Blood, I generally knew that these secret level paths existed, but I was like resolving to myself, okay, I'm just going to play the intended paths first time around, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to beat all the secret level paths. But like, they were just so enticing and, frequently coming up in the levels. Like, I just couldn't resist at some point. I'm just like, okay, fine, this is really cool. I guess I'll go check it out. Maybe I'll do the regular path the next time around and stuff like that, so it just shows how much of a pull it has as far as the exploration goes. It's like, once you do the thing and then all of a sudden, oh man, there's a whole nother section of level here. It's like, well, you can't expect me to not go, right? So, yeah.
Yeah,
I thought that was pretty neat, personally.
I even found there were places where I would go down secret paths, quote unquote, without really realizing that was a secret path. I think one that, in hindsight, I think is obviously a secret, but it's the one where there's this raft and you have to jump on the raft as it falls down a river. It falls off screen, but I looked at that and thought, okay, so I'm supposed to hop on the raft next. Even though it takes you off screen, that should have killed me. I should have thought of it that way, but for whatever reason, I just saw it as another pathway, and then I went down that. And then at some point later, I was like, oh yeah, I have to go back and actually see the other side of that level. So yeah, the world opening up in that way is really, really rad, and they did a nice job with how the levels interconnect with each other and have these different routes to go through. It's very different than your typical side-scroller where it's go from left to right. In this, in some cases, you kind of just back and forth and interweave, and they did a nice job of making it feel like an actual labyrinth.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't know if that's just a Castlevania signature, because I also felt very interested in how Castlevania 4's structures would be a little bit loopy all over the place. But you get double the dose of that with Rondo of Blood, because they kind of have to diverge in odd and interesting ways in order to make very clear that, main path this way, alternate path you're going some other way and such. So these alternate exit paths would be fun divergences in and of their own right. but they happen to be culminating in the very nice reward of secret levels. So when you complete one of these alternative exit paths, you will get to play one of these alternative secret levels. And when you're on a secret level, you can finish the alternative exit path and it will go to another secret level, or you finish the regular exit and you go back onto the normal levels. So there's 8 normal levels and 4 secret levels. And because of the fact that they arrange it in the way that I previously mentioned, where you can get to a secret level either by finishing an alternative exit path from another secret level or the alternative exit path from a regular level, it means that if you want to play all the secret levels, you'll have 2 methods of unlocking each of them, which is very nice because some of these ways of unlocking secret levels, while very, clever and interesting, are not that particularly intuitive. But between having 2 different methods of unlocking every secret level, you're probably going to be able to find them all without too much issue.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So there are 4 maidens which you can rescue via various secrets during the level. And on the main screen, as you start rescuing them, they start showing up one after the next, side to side. And, because of that, you'll be able to tell, okay, I'm missing one, I gotta go back, and so forth. Every time you rescue a maiden, there is a little anime cutscene where they sort of, talk with Richter and have a moment before, you get to save them and feel like the hero, which is rather cathartic. And one of the maidens that you rescue happens to be Maria, which unlocks the alternate secret path. So having the extra secret maidens, it provides a nice reward, and you get to have a slightly different ending credit sequence if you rescue all 4 of them, which is also kind of nice. So just another extra way that Rondo of Blood adds a rewarding exploration experience, I would say. I would say that in general, my favorite example of exploration regarding Rondo of Blood would be the boulders in level 4A. So part of the level ascends you through a staircase with massive, slow-moving boulders carrying enemies on top. At this point in the game, you're trained to look for secrets in pits. So some clever players may ask, I wonder what happens if I go down the pit that the boulder's going into. At this point, you are treated to a side path for the level, which is not even the alternate exit path. This is just a side path that the programmers decided to throw in there. During this little side path, you follow the boulders to a pulley system coming out of a pit in the ground, which carries the boulders out of a pit. You need to ascend using a combination of this pulley system and the platforms to the side of the pulley system while fighting off monsters. Then at the very top, you find a burly monster who is lifting the boulders off the pulley system and putting them onto the staircase that you were trying to ascend. So that's right, for you Dark Souls veterans out there, Rondo of Blood did Sense Fortress before it was cool.
I did catch that. That was a very cool sequence. I'm glad I played enough of the game to actually find it. It was a pretty rad discovery.
Yeah, I actually don't know if I... Oh, yeah, that's right. I remember that particular level, it's actually an interesting example of where the difficulty and the exploration sort of interlinked well, because I was stuck on that level for a decent chunk of time, and that level has several different alternate exit paths, so every time that I'd get a game over against the boss, like, rather than just retreading the same ground to get to him, I would usually be like, you know what, maybe I can try a different path to get to him, which might result in better heart acquisition, or just a different boss I gotta fight, or something along those lines and whatnot. Well, I guess I should clarify. I tried doing the same thing maybe like 3 or 4 times, and then once I got my butt kicked that number of times, then I'm like, okay, maybe I'll try something else. So for that reason, it's kind of nice because it means that like the exploration is used an angle to like keep the levels feeling fresh, even when you're dying repeatedly against the boss and trying to beat the level and stuff like that, which is kind of nice. But yeah, that moment in particular, I thought that it was especially great because it has such strong integration with the logic and the design of the level. And it ends up also just being a nice reward in its own right, even if it doesn't give you an extra alternate exit boss, because it's a unique and fun challenge trying to, ascend the pulleys while fighting off the enemies to the left and right and stuff. It's not like typical left to right video game progression. You kind of got to do some little, jumping around and not falling down and I don't know. Yeah. I thought it was a fun time, personally.
Yeah, the whole discovery element of this game is mind-opening. And I think it's a kind of interesting thing to contrast with the challenge and achievement side of it, which I don't think feels quite the same way. That one's rewarding, but you have to work at it, and you have to understand the expectations, and you have to start finding a way to jive with what the game wants you to do. And so I find them two interesting, like different but complementary ways to make for a worthwhile experience. And I think the combined effort of them makes it really richer for it.
Yeah, that is kind of an interesting contrast because, like, when it comes to like challenge and achievement, it's much more a matter of trade-offs in a way where, like, okay, well,
Yeah.
you can make this enemy easier, but it means there'll be a less satisfying experience of beating it. And like, okay, well, you can make your character more easy to move, but then it might trivialize his boss or things like that. But like when it comes to like exploration, in a way, the main like trade-off is just development time versus player enjoyment, because you can just dump more secrets onto them like to an almost endless degree, and it's usually going to improve the experience at least a little bit.
And what about your cons? I think you had a couple of those for this category as well.
Yeah, so unfortunately, and this is sort of what I alluded to previously, the atmosphere is less immersive and less captivating compared to Castlevania 4. So there's the dual style battles that I mentioned previously, the anime cutscenes, which I'll get to a bit more in the art direction, and also a soundtrack that is more often rocking than it is haunting. So for those reasons, along with some things that might be a little hard to put my finger on, I would say that Rondo of Blood has an atmosphere that at times feels more akin to a shonen anime compared to Castlevania 4's dark and moody exploration. And when I say more akin to, I mean compared with Castlevania 4. I mean, it still has a decent amount of Castlevania vibes, but just didn't quite reach the highs of Castlevania 4's atmosphere, in my opinion. Now, mind you, to the extent that Rondo of Blood does have a certain amount of shonen anime, feeling to it, I still like that atmosphere, but along with it just not liking it as much as the dark and moody exploration, it also just doesn't really put me in the shoes of Richter as much as Castlevania 4 put me in the shoes of Simon. And when I am less immersed in the character of Richter, it tends to hurt the exploration experience for me in particular, because it makes me feel less like I'm in the game doing the exploration, and more like I'm watching a character who's exploring on screen. Now again, it's not like it's like that all the time, but if you're comparing it to Castlevania 4, it's generally less immersive than Castlevania 4 is, for me personally. Anything you want to add on to that?
I do, but I think I'm going to let you kind of jump into your art direction thoughts.
Sure, sounds good. So yeah, to wrap things up with the last category for Rondo of Blood, we have art direction. So I figured that in some ways, the visuals that we're going to display are going to sort of sell it. But to give a brief overview of my thoughts on the matter, so as previously mentioned, this is using the Super CD version of the PC Engine. This hardware had a higher pixel density and a larger number of colors compared to Castlevania 4. And in my opinion, the game utilized this hardware to the fullest. They used it to create detailed sprites for Richter and the enemies, which fit the Gothic atmosphere pretty well, in my opinion. As a result of the increased pixel density, Richter can have a more detailed sprite compared to Simon from Castlevania 4, and he also takes up less of the overall screen real estate than Simon took in Castlevania 4. This allows for more large views, which also allows for larger feeling monsters and larger feeling levels. So sort of a nice gameplay art direction interaction there. Having a CD-ROM for this particular version of Castlevania also generally means that the amount of storage space you have is much larger. So the soundtrack is going to be of much higher audio quality, but it also means that Round of Blood can have a number of animated cutscenes and include voice acting with those cutscenes, which is rather nice. The cutscenes are chock full of 90s anime charm, but some, such as myself, may find that they don't quite fit the Gothic enemies and levels that well. And then the last thing I want to mention as far as art direction benefits is that the bosses have really cool intro animations, which gets you hyped up to fight them, and they have satisfying death animations when you finish them off. So that's sort of what I have to say about art direction. Mitch, do you want to elaborate a bit more on your thoughts you alluded to earlier?
Just a few things. Yeah, the visual detail is much less busy than it is in Castlevania 4. Rondo is more simple, it's easy on the eyes, it's also vibrantly colored, and this vibrancy is put against harsh blacks, which makes them stand out all the more. And I actually really liked that. You're right that the PC Engine really has it where color is concerned. I also thought the cinematic cutscenes elevated the experience quite a bit for me. They have minimal animation, but the pixel art is top-notch that, I was really just happy that they were there at all. Its myriad of inspirations is still retained, but everything has been repainted given that kind of shonen anime aesthetic. And yeah, I agree, it's not to everyone's taste. But, it was still kind of haunting in its own right. I mean, I think it's works for the most part, but I would venture to say that the inclusion of Maria is where things really start to deviate. I mean, you can notice it, of course, with the ways Richter is dressed, but when you rescue Maria and she's like,
"Who are you, mister? A good guy?"
I am Richter Belmont, vampire hunter. And you are?
My name's Maria Renard.
what is this conversation with this like weird music box thing? It just is a very, very different vibe. And so if you don't like anime, you're gonna have that European aesthetic is present, but it's done in an anime way. So you're gonna have to reconcile that. In comparison, I agree that some of the backgrounds are a little too empty of visuals. And it's nice because you can focus on the game and you don't get distracted, but also like, I don't know, it's just a little too empty. Like I'm thinking of the dungeon in particular, which is almost completely black as a background. So it's good mechanically because everything is up front and clear, but it can sometimes be a little bit at the expense of an attractively compelling environment for me. So it's kind of a pro and a con at the same time.
Yeah, I could see that. But it's kind of interesting because I actually remember that, like, when I first wrote this script, I mentioned that the foregrounds and backgrounds aren't as lovingly detailed in Castlevania 4. But then I was going back on it, and it's like, the foregrounds and backgrounds here are still really good. So it feels weird to count that as a con. And it kind of made me wonder if it's just a carry-on effect from the atmosphere being less good. Maybe because I was less sold by the, vibes of the experience. Maybe I was just paying less attention to those foreground and background details when they did come up, and so they didn't really sell it as much for me and stuff like that. Because there is sometimes a lot of background detail and things like that,
Are you talking about Rondo or?
Yeah, Rondo still
Okay.
has a lot of background details in a lot of scenes, but it's like it felt like it was
It felt
a lot less
yeah.
than in Castlevania 4. And I don't know how much of that is just strictly having less of it, or how much of it was because I was less sold by the atmosphere, I was paying less attention to it, or getting less enjoyment from it, or something along those lines. So I removed it for ambiguity's sake, but and because it's still pretty good background, so I don't want to hold it against it that hard or anything like that, Yeah, I don't know. It was just an interesting reflection I sort of came across when I was like looking at the video while I was editing my script and such.
Well, this is where it's interesting to talk about Rondo of Blood because, its overall standing is not nearly as pronounced as Castlevania 4 was. And that's in part because of me, I guess. It didn't really win me over in the same way, but I did put it down for discovery and expression and art direction. It was still on my list. I can't remember where I ranked them specifically, but those two, it was in by both of us. And so I don't know, but I guess it's more like the overall package is just a little bit different. Like, I know there are diehard fans of Rondo, but for me, the shift in direction has really created a negative impact, I think, like, when I boil it all down. Like, they've basically turned away from everything that I loved about Castlevania 4. We're back to old school combat, the visual aesthetic is anime themed now, and together they make for a perfectly suitable combination. It's a good game, but I'm with James Rolfe on this one. I like 8-directional combat. I think that created a more symbiotic relationship between the player and the avatar. Yeah, it made you overpowered, but that was a level design problem. And it's only a problem if you don't think the player should feel empowered. And I also believe the visual style should maintain an effort to represent its sources of inspiration. Gothic literature, Universal horror pictures, Greek mythology. That's a pretty unique blend that only gets distracted by leaning so hard in the anime direction. And it is a really heavy lean. Like, Richter has a bright blue outfit and a Ryu-style headband. Like, come on. And then you have Maria, who's basically a preppy schoolgirl. It's not to be a cynic, but, this effort to reinvent Castlevania, I don't know, it becomes a genuine problem for the series down the road, I think. Zelda seems to be that only series that can radically change styles and get away with it. And it can do this because Link's age is not constant. Zelda takes place in like different timelines and there's different variations of the same world happening. So, it's a risky proposition, but there's like some narrative justification for it that I don't feel quite exists in the same way for Castlevania. And, if Halo isn't allowed to change its visual style, I don't see why Castlevania should get a free pass either. So, yeah, I don't know. It's like, I like it as it exists independently. Like, if I just appreciate it as Rondo of Blood, but if I put the name Castlevania on it, then it suddenly starts to create conflict and it hurts like expectations and these kinds of things. And
interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because I think for me, because they didn't call it Castlevania 5, I do kind of look at it as more of a standalone experience. Though that might be in part because of the fact that I'm coming from a background of knowing that this is a different director, so I'm going to be getting their own personal interpretation of Castlevania and such.
Yeah, that's a good point. And like they're very different directions just on every level, right? Because it's so interesting to me how Castlevania 4, which is the remake of the first game, has less in common with that one than this one does from a pure like gameplay perspective. I mean, there's like you can really fine tune it down, but if you're talking about like the whip combat, the use of the sub weapons, and the kind of challenge and expectations, like Rondo is that satisfying sequel, whereas Castlevania 4 is this like new age kind of effort. But it's also like very much grounded in old school games too, because it's got like a timer that you don't need, a scoring system that you don't need, and these are relics that have kind of maintained themselves throughout. So it's just a very interesting game, like that it exists at its present time. It's almost like a lightning in a bottle sort of situation. Like, yeah, it could be this refined masterpiece on the level of something that's just untouchable, but it is that, but it also is understanding of its history, and it doesn't remove itself from that too much either. And I guess I find that a really novel thing to discuss about Castlevania 4. Maybe that's why it was such a big game for me last season. Whereas in this one, it's like I guess I'm talking around the subject of trying to get at like the kind of overall, the emotional catharsis, the kind of like resolution I'm supposed to sort of pick up on. And I don't know, it like, and I should have been able to pick up onto it by this point, right? Because Castlevania 4, it's stage 3, and I've got it. I'm like, okay, I'm all for this. This is really cool and interesting. I like where this is going. And this one, it was just this constant kind of uphill battle, and there's some highlights and there's some downsides. Like, I do like Rondo's visuals, but to say that the change in visuals does not fundamentally alter the meaning of the experience, I think would be wrong. Like, I like Castlevania 4 because it's almost the equivalent of taking part in like a gothic novel or a universal picture or Greek tragedy, and not being able to succinctly tell which one I'm in is like part of the reward. And now that it's anime, it's like all I see is anime. And I do love a good anime, but the association with Castlevania means it's now a different meaning. So, I don't know. In other words, playing Rondo of Blood doesn't mean the same thing for me, and this stuff is not window dressing. It's kind of like the main reason why I'm here or where my interest lies.
Yeah, and I do agree that the art style and etc. do make it a bit of a different experience. But I think that, that's done in a way deliberately, because I think that because they have this story where it's like Dracula has a bit more philosophical leanings to him when he monologues, and Richter has all these moments where he can be the hero who saves the girl, and like he ends up being the one who's like, oh, don't worry, it's just a little blood loss, not a big deal, and stuff like that. I really think that they were trying to emphasize Richter and Dracula's struggle as more of a symbol of like the goodest good versus evil, and like the underpinnings of that and stuff like that, and I still like it, even if I don't like the vibes as much as Castlevania 4. And I appreciate the fact that they kind of really, it reasonably well. I think that they actually committed to the concept and tried to carry it throughout the entire experience to a certain extent, as far as really trying to make Richter a symbol of like the goodest good against all the symbols of evil and what that means and things like that, So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fine experience, and I don't know, maybe for some people that will be more attractive to them because, I get that the original is really lacking in those kind of cinematic moments. You basically have to fill that all in with your imagination, which I'm happy to do. That worked for me. I felt like I had enough material to get there, and this one sort of was filling in blanks and doing it in a way that I wasn't quite as comfortable with, but teach their own.
Yeah, sure, fair point. Okay, so, wrapping things up with Rondo of Blood, aside from the categories that Rondo of Blood is nominated for, I consider it to be good in most other categories, even if not quite good enough to get nominations. While Rondo of Blood is light on story elements, I personally rather enjoyed the story that was there and found it to match the feel of the gameplay well. And I especially think that the game's soundtrack is very good, only missing out on nomination status due to not enhancing the gameplay enough. That being said, don't play Rondo if you want to relax or make friends. These forms of enjoyment are not conducive to difficult single-player games. While Rondo of Blood was not able to garner a Best Pixel nomination, I still definitely consider it to be a game worth playing, and a worthy entry in the Castlevania series. If you do play it, I recommend you either play it as part of Castlevania Requiem for the PlayStation 4, or you use a PC Engine emulator in conjunction with a ROM that has been fan-translated to English. You can try playing it as part of Castlevania Chronicles for PSP, but the version of Rondo of Blood that is included has a number of bugs, so I hear. With that, is there anything else you want to add, Mitch, before we wrap this video up?
No, I think you said it brilliantly. Take it away.
With that, I bid you listeners good night. Don't let the vampires bite. Mwah!